then, of course, this is George W. Bush Jr. They cut off Haiti from IMF, World Bank, all the usual things for destabilization before the CIA finally moves in, often literally for the kill, or at least figuratively for the kill in the overthrow. Then one day, the U.S. ambassador walks in and guides Aristide out to a plane with the unmarked tail. And 23 hours later, he's in Central Africa. Okay, this is what is known as a coup, a CIA coup. So I know the reporter that covers this beat in the New York Times, and I call her. And I said the next day, you're not going to cover the coup. They walked the president out to an unmarked tail, fly him out to Central. You're not. And she said, Jeff, the editor's not interested. That's all the news that's fit to print.
Yeah.
And then I was, America is a surreal place. The next Monday or Tuesday, I was testifying in Congress on a hearing where everyone was saying how they loved Haiti and would do everything, and how good it was that the U.S. had protected the president of Haiti from harm's way because there were belligerents that were coming to attack him. And then, of course, everything is completely forgotten in the next hour, and that's the end of it. Yeah. So this is typical for how things act right now. And if you act with this impunity, if there is no accountability, the recklessness, the stupidity, really the imbecility of it continues to expand. And that's where we are today. And it's extraordinarily dangerous because not only are we doing terrible things, but we're doing delusional things. Like Blinken saying, we are going to make sure that NATO enlarges to Ukraine as hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians are dying on the battlefield. And we have no way, plan, shape, or decency. I mean, the whole idea is mistaken, but no way to do that. But what we are doing is guaranteeing that the war will continue.
And by the way, speaking of Haiti, the 20th anniversary of that coup was just in February, and we're still learning about it. France's ambassador at the time, recently, a few years ago, admitted that France and the U.S. orchestrated that coup against Aristide. And by the way, that was the second time Aristide was overthrown in a U.S.-backed coup.
Yeah, and by the way, I was at diplomatic gatherings where people were bragging about this afterwards. The Belgians, the French, laughing about this stuff.
And look at Haiti now; it's descended into such absolute chaos, and yet nobody can trace it back to our critical role in destabilizing the country by overthrowing its first popularly elected president.
You look all around the world; these actions destabilize places for decades, for generations. They're based on violence, imbecility, and lies. They suborn local leaders. They distort everything about local politics. And of course, there's zero accountability for the United States. And the legacy of this, look at Brzezinski's brilliant move of putting jihadists into Afghanistan in 1979. We're still now 45 years later, a country completely destroyed for 2 generations, almost no understanding in the United States at all, almost no connecting the dots of how this CIA operation back in 1979 has led step by step by step to unending chaos. Look at Iran, which you mentioned, 1953, overthrowing a democratically elected government because somehow, weirdly, our oil had gotten under their sand, as they say. And we've done this in so many places. And the legacy of it, Libya, Syria, more recently, Ukraine is the same way. It poisons politics, even for generations, because it's violent, it's so stupid in its direction, so arrogant and wrongheaded. It's done covertly, so called, because what is being done is so far from what should be done that it's hidden and deniable from view. And so it's horrible policies done in a way guaranteed to poison the politics of these places for decades. You know, when I go to Southeast Asia, which is quite frequently, there are places today you do lots of places you do not walk because the unexploded ordnance of America's secret wars are all over the farmlands in Laos, in Cambodia, until today. The U.S. government, by the way, is still trying to collect debt from a regime that it installed in place, destabilized the entire country, lent it money for emergency food aid, bombed the place relentlessly, and is trying to get repaid till today.
Speaking of coups, you, of course, have traced the current war in Ukraine back to 2014, and you say that the United States helped create that coup.
Of course.
And you were there. You said you saw things up close, certain things up close and personal. Can you talk about some of the things that you were able to see because of your involvement in that region that others weren't able to see?
Yeah, I mean, the one thing that I saw was that immediately after the coup, I was called by the new government. I didn't know what had happened, but the prime minister said, I'd like to meet with you to discuss this economic crisis. And so I had advised the government in Ukraine back in the early 1990s. And of course, the prime minister asked me, and I went. And when I went, I was taken around the Maidan where people were still milling around. And the American NGOs were around there. And they were describing to me, oh, we paid for this, we paid for that, we funded this insurrection. It turned my stomach, by the way. I had my meeting, got on the plane, went home, and that was the end of that. But I saw the bragging. Now, US NGOs funding this uprising, they didn't do that on their own as nice NGOs. This is, let's just say, off-budget financing for a U.S. regime change operation. And then the Russians did us a good favor of helping us to understand what this was all about because they intercepted the call between Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piat, who was then the U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, describing how they were going to put Yatsenyuk, the prime minister, into power. This was weeks before, but they had already chosen him as the new prime minister. And he's the guy that called me to ask me. Of course, I didn't know anything about this call at the time, but you can listen to it. And there it's the plotting. And by the way, how bizarre it is. It's online. Thank you to the Russian government for intercepting it, giving us some insight into what the U.S. government does. And not a word of explanation from the U.S. from that date on. And basically, where the reporters in the White House pool or in the State Department pool on any given day from February 2014 until today asking about that. And if they did, of course, they'd get that indelible smirk of Admiral Kirby or of Matt Miller, who can't even lie with a straight face because they're having such a good time with their idiocy. But they would deny that there ever was such a phone call. And it would be online, and they would say, no, it doesn't exist. Yes, but Mr. Miller, it's right there. No, sorry, it just doesn't exist. And that's and the New York Times would say there were unfounded allegations that a call existed, and it was linked to the following website, but this website obviously doesn't exist. That's how the New York Times would report it if it covered it at all.
The counter argument you will get, or that I get from people who support the proxy war in Ukraine about the Nuland call, is that Nuland was not plotting the overthrow of the government. Nuland was trying to work out who should serve with Yanukovych, who was then the current president, who Nuland was trying to overthrow, in a power-sharing government. Because it is true that at the time Yanukovych offered the opposition, in a bid to defuse the Maidan crisis, a power-sharing deal. So Nuland and Piat were just doing their part, to plot about who should come in and serve alongside Yanukovych. The problem with that, first of all, is that on the call, it shows that Nuland and Piet are picking who should serve in government. So
exactly.
It shows,
even if that's the interpretation, it's the U.S. is making a government, for God's sake. Come on.
Yes. And then that same Maidan movement, where they're deciding who should be the leaders, they ultimately, the hardcore nationalist component of that Maidan movement rejected the power sharing agreement, launched a coup with violence, and without a sufficient quorum in parliament, installed a new government and put Yatsenyuk, who Nuland had selected, as the new leader. So,
of course. And by the way, within 24 hours, recognized by the United States,
exactly,
contrary to an agreement that was reached. This is what's called a coup. Yeah. So whether it went exactly as was expected on around, I think, January 27th or so, when this call was made, I don't know the date exactly. It's unclear. I think it was posted or it's claimed to be. BBC covers it as if it's in early February. Yeah. But whatever it is, it's obnoxious as it is completely. Not Klitschko. We've got Yatsenyuk. Yats is the guy. We're going to bring in. The big guy. That means Biden to do the attaboy on this. The United States is making the government of Ukraine. Excuse me. So that's a coup, by the way. And then when you find out that the Maidan was paid for by the U.S., okay, that's another piece of it. And then, of course, I would love for the CIA to show us the books and tell us what really happened. And now that Victoria Nuland is my incoming colleague at Columbia University, I'm sure she's going to give a seminar explaining all of the details of this. So I'll let you know what we hear in the seminar.
Maybe she'll give a baking seminar about how to make those cookies.
She may well do so.
Well, listen, we've covered some really important historical context, but let's turn to some of the present calamities. It's hard to know where to start.
Yeah, where to start, right?
Let me actually begin by asking you about Israel's strike on Syria recently, because they attacked the Iranian embassy in Damascus, killing a very senior commander with the IRGC. What do you think Israel's goal was here, and what do you make of this new line being crossed? Bombing a diplomatic facility, which according to international law is actually the sovereign territory of the country that inhabits it. So basically, Israel's basically bombing Iran by doing this.
Well, I think the line that Israel has really crossed is committing a genocide with the cameras rolling and saying that we do so with complete impunity. And if the UN Security Council calls for an immediate ceasefire, we ignore that entirely. Today's explanation of the bombing of the food relief operations was AI systems automatically targeting thousands and thousands of deaths and murder. Knowing Israeli startups, that could well be the case. But Israel has crossed so many lines in this. It's a completely rogue operation. It's in complete violation of the 1948 Genocide Convention, of the Geneva Codes, of the UN Charter. One doesn't know where to start, but sending a missile into Iranian diplomatic territory is attempting to widen the war. I think the Israeli government is extremely eager that their vassal state, also known as the United States, will join in a war against Iran. So I think the intention is to widen the war.
What are the real intentions when you talk about hegemony, for instance? What does that mean in real concrete terms? Like, what does the U.S. want when it bleeds Russia?
The U.S. wants to be in a situation that no government in the world opposes U.S. policies on anything, whether it's on economics or natural resource disposition or locations of pipelines or, of course, locations of military forces or governments that might tax U.S. companies. Anything that the U.S. would oppose the U.S. wants a subservient government. That's what hegemony means. Hegemony means that you have a government that will do the U.S. bidding. And this is carried out basically by the archipelago of U.S. military forces around the world. It's estimated at between 800 and 900 military bases in 80 countries of the world. So the U.S. Basically, even in effect, occupies many of these countries. It seems strange, but when you have the U.S. military bases there, the governments are afraid to move against the U.S., often for some pretty obvious reasons, but even friendly or allied governments, even Japan, they're afraid of the U.S. And it's a strange idea. It seems like an alliance, but it's not quite like that. So the U.S. wants to make sure that no one crosses the U.S. And what this means is that any large country is inherently an affront to U.S. hegemony. And two in particular right now, but there's a third one that will come this way, are affronts to the U.S. Russia's too big for the U.S., and China's too big for the U.S. And so we hate them. We hate them because everything they do, we interpret in a way to generate the public hatred and fear. And so this is, by the way, the out of the playbook of the British Empire, which was really the tutor of the American Empire, because Britain did all of this in the 19th century, what the United States started doing in the second half of the 20th century. Britain came to hate Russia in the 1840s, so much so that when Russia got into a tiff with the Ottoman Empire in 1850, the Brits stepped forward and said, time to invade Russia. And that was the Crimean War, which was 1853 to 1856. Very similar dynamics. By the way, this is the second Crimean War. It's almost to the playbook, because the idea of the first Crimean War was surround Russia in the Black Sea, deny Russia's access to its naval base in Sevastopol. Same story as today. Same words you hear from MI6, from the British, from the Ukrainians. We're going to attack Crimea. It's exactly the repeat of 1853. But what was the reason for Russophobia of Britain in the 1840s? Well, it wasn't communism. It wasn't Putin. It wasn't any of that. It was Russia was so big that it was an affront to British hegemony. And the crazy idea back in the 1840s, which moved public opinion, was the idea that Russia was going to invade India from Central Asia through the Khyber Pass in Afghanistan and take over Britain's crown jewel of empire. Of course, completely fantastical. It had absolutely nothing to do with what the czars wanted to do, with what Russia was capable or wanted to do, but it drove war. And this is what we have today, which is America asserts its right of control over everybody. They call it literally primacy or full spectrum dominance, we call it hegemony. But whichever term one uses, the countries that are an affront to that are the enemy. And I mentioned that there's a third one. Right now, the U.S. is angling that India will be on our side against China. But India is a big civilization and country, and you can pretty much imagine the U.S. Coming to see India as this great threat. Not today, 10 years, 20 years. It's a dynamic which is absolutely awful. And by the way, just to put the scholarly gloss on it, John Mearsheimer, whom I'm very good friends with and I admire a lot but disagree with very strongly on a core principle, wrote a book called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. It's his great realist foreign policy book of 2001. And he wrote at the beginning, we have good relations with China right now, but they will worsen. And he called it, by the way. He called it entirely. I said at the time, why should they worsen? We have no trouble. No, they're going to worsen. Why are they going to worsen? Because China is going to become a major power. I said, yeah, okay, so. Right. No, because then they'll worsen, because then it's going to be a threat. He said, John, it's not a threat unless we make it a threat. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. He said, yeah. Right. I said, John, we got to stop the self-fulfilling prophecy. He says, you can't. So that's the difference of the realist and me, is I believe we could actually talk with each other and find peaceful approaches. But the point is, hegemony means we control what we want to control, where we want to control it. We control which governments operate. If a government is not to our taste, we replace it with war or with a covert regime change operation or some other subterfuge of the National Endowment of Democracy or some NGO that does the politics for us. That's what hegemony means.
Let's start with the one that's going on for the longest, which is the war in Ukraine. I think every time in the past when we've spoken, we've talked about how it seems very difficult to imagine the Ukrainians winning in the way that the West defined victory, namely expelling the Russians from every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea. And yet the Western press has been painting a very rosy picture of how the Ukrainians are feisty and how they're performing better than anyone would think. Finally now, clearly the media narrative has shifted in the West. Even I think the U.S. government's tone has shifted. And it's obvious now that the Russians are breaking through Ukrainian front lines, are advancing, are gaining territory, while the Ukrainians are gaining none. And even the Ukrainians, everyone except Zelensky, I think, admits the situation is pretty dire. What do you make of the situation just on the battleground in terms of the war itself?
Of course, the Ukrainians are being beaten. But what's very interesting, Glenn, and exactly in your line of work, if one listened not to the Western media, but also to the Russian channels and to independent media over the years, it's not as if there was some sudden change. What is happening right now, which is the defeat of Ukraine on the battlefield, is a steady process that's been happening now for more than 2 years. So there's no dramatic moment of change. There has been a war of attrition that Russia has been winning. The propaganda in the West has disguised that. And even until today, you have absurdly optimistic statements by Secretary Blinken and others. But if you listen to the facts on the ground, not in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Institute for the Study of War or all of the British media, but a much wider range of news, nothing that's happening now is a surprise or even a shift from the underlying trend that has been underway now for 2 years. After all, Ukraine was completely bloodied and failed in its so-called counteroffensive last summer. It already lost significant areas of Bakhmut and others in the spring of last year on its key defense lines in the Donbass. So what's happening now, which is dramatic, is not a surprise, and it's not even a decisive change of direction, except in the Western media.
I think, as somebody who covers free speech and censorship and debates adjacent to it quite often, one of the most extreme things I've seen in, let's say, the last 5 years, maybe even the last decade along those lines, is that the EU, just a couple of months into this war, made it illegal to give a platform to any Russian state media, such as RT or Sputnik. So if you as an American adult or a European adult, more specifically, more accurately, wanted to hear what the Russian media was saying, wanted to hear what the Russian government's version of events was, not to believe it, but just to have the comparison, hearing both sides, it was basically a crime to platform them. And the platform that our show is on, which is Rumble, is actually banned in France as a result of their refusal to remove RT and Sputnik. And so this information bubble was deliberately cultivated, and I think did quite an effective job in propagandizing the citizenry to the point probably a lot of people are shocked that Russia actually is doing so well. Now, one of the arguments that war proponents are making, because war proponents in the United States never admit error. There's never a moment where they say, our predictions about the war didn't come true, it was misguided, it was an error, we made a lot of false assumptions. What they're now trying to say is, yes, Russia is winning, but the reason for that is that the Republicans held up the $60 billion package for so long in Congress, namely for about 3 months. And if you go back in history, you look at every war where the U.S. failed in its objectives, and they always make that same argument. Oh, we were constrained by war opponents. We would have won in Vietnam had it not been for the protest movement. We would have won in Iraq had they unleashed more force. We would have won in Afghanistan had we stayed longer. We would have won in Syria had Obama not tied the hands of the CIA. That's obviously what they're saying now. As you said, the evidence of Ukraine's failures predate by a long time the Republican impediment for a couple months or 3 months of the $60 billion package. But what do you make of that argument? What's your response to it?
First, let me say a word about the European bubble, because I lived in Vienna for much of last year. I was completely shocked. Even when I was scheduled to give a public address or an interview, sometimes the venues would cancel. Because they didn't want to hear an independent, objective, scholarly assessment. They were afraid. That is too much pro-Russian. I'm pro-peace, by the way. I'm pro-truth. So it wasn't pro-Russian or not pro-Russian. It was pro-facts. But I saw the bubble in shocking ways all through Europe. I had the experience, Glenn, after Nord Stream blew up. The U.S. blew it up, if anyone is still curious about that fact. But when I said it on American television, I was canceled within literally 30 seconds. And then subjected to a rant by the anchor for a few minutes. How dare he say these things? But then I was canceled in Europe the same way, in a very strange way, because I was an unpaid but formal advisor to the EU diplomatic corps, just as an academic expert. And when I said that, yes, the U.S. blew up Nord Stream, I was immediately, quote, fired. Again, there was nothing commercial in it, no funding, but I was taken off the list. They do not want to hear any of this. And this is absolutely amazing. So we have been living in this completely false narrative. It is absolutely not true that this delay in the armaments has to do with anything, by the way. Look at what our General Petraeus said last year about Ukraine's counteroffensive. It's interesting to go back and read how Ukraine's going to prove it's going to slash right through the Russian defenses and so forth. And all of this optimism and blather that we heard so many times in the U.S., and it was all completely wrong, completely. And when it proved completely wrong, no one ever had even a story to say, well, what happened? We said, somebody said this, and it turned out to be this. Isn't that interesting? If you follow this story closely, essentially, the U.S. has been gambling repeatedly. They've been gambling with a guaranteed losing hand. This is important to understand. Obama did figure this out back in 2014. He figured out that Russia has what was called then escalatory dominance, that whatever we do, Russia would escalate. Why? Because for Russia, the stakes of what's going on in Ukraine are existential, but for us, it's a geopolitical game. Not more than a game, by the way, and that's how it's viewed by these game theorists. They want NATO in Ukraine. So everything, Glenn, that they banked on proved to be wrong. And the group that was banking on it is the same group as today. It was Biden, Sullivan, Newland, who's now my colleague at Columbia University.
Right.
She's out. But Blinken, it's the same group. Now, they gambled in 2014 that they could help to instigate a coup, and that all would kind of settle down in the U.S. favor. Gamble wrong, because Putin did what he said he would do. No way you guys are taking away our Sevastopol naval base just because you launch a coup. And so Russia took back Crimea with that referendum in 2014, in March 2014. Okay, that was the first gamble wrong. Second gamble, there was the outbreak of ethnic Russians who did not want to be under this coup-led government of the Ukrainian nationalists. And so this insurrection started in the Donbass. And Russia actually said very constructively, peace and autonomy for this region. That was the Minsk agreements. And not only were there agreements reached on how to end this post-coup conflict that our side didn't count on, but they were agreements that were backed by the UN Security Council and backed by Germany and France. U.S. gamble number two, blow off these agreements. Privately agree with Ukraine. No need to do any of that. We had our experts here saying how decentralization in Ukraine would be a bad idea. Don't give autonomy to the region. Okay, failed again. Then, because the war continued, then Putin put on the table a security arrangement with the United States, a draft on December 15, 2021. I called the White House afterward. I think you and I have spoken about that. I told them, negotiate, avoid this war. Well, they gambled again. They felt, what's Putin going to do? It's all a bluff. We don't have to negotiate over NATO enlargement. Nah, nothing too much terrible is going to happen. That's what I heard. Wrong. Gambled again. Then in March 2022, just essentially 3 weeks after the launch of Russia's special military operation, we can't say the start of the war because that started in 2014, but the escalation of the war that started on February 24th, 2022, Ukraine said, okay, we'll be neutral. And under the auspices of Turkish mediators, they essentially initialed an agreement, very close. The U.S. stepped in and told Zelensky, you don't have to do this. We've got HIMARS coming your way. We've got tanks coming your way. We've got crushing financial sanctions coming your way. We've got your back. This was another gamble. This was another escalation of a losing hand on the U.S. side. What these people, Biden, Blinken, Sullivan, Nuland, can't get is that for Russia, this is really national security. For these people, it's a game. It's a game of expanding NATO. NATO doesn't have to be in Ukraine for U.S. security. It's to be in Ukraine to, quote, weaken Russia or to surround Russia. But for Russia, Russia doesn't want the U.S. on their border. And so our side does absolutely not understand that they cannot get their way. All they can do is drive Ukraine into dust, into now 500,000 deaths of Ukrainians, and the number is soaring now, often 1,000 a day, 1,500 a day, because there's a bloodbath underway. But nothing is shocking except the stupidity of the U.S. policy, which has gambled and gambled and gambled. But I guess it's not their lives, it's not their money, it's Ukrainian lives, it's American people's money. So they don't care about this gambling, it seems. But nothing is a surprise, Glenn.
Yeah, so we're talking about two different points, which was my fault because of my last question. I asked you about two different points. So I just want to break them down for a second. We're kind of talking about both the discourse around the war and the tolerance for dissent and debate, and then also what the U.S. policy has been. So let me just first focus on the question of the discourse. I'm very aware that the U.S. government propagandizes in partnership with the corporate media, especially when it comes to foreign policy and war. Sometimes, though, it really is stunning to watch. As you said, for all the harsh critiques I had of President Obama's foreign policy and his continuation of the war on terror, it is true, and you can go back and read this, that he was attacked by members of both parties because he wasn't willing to send lethal arms to Ukraine. He didn't want to confront the Russians in Syria, saying it's not worth that kind of confrontation. And he gave an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg, the neoconservative editor-in-chief of The Atlantic, on his way out in 2016. It was a major interview on foreign policy called the Obama Foreign Policy Doctrine. And Jeffrey Goldberg kind of harassed him very critically, like, why wouldn't you do more to confront Russia and protect Ukraine? And what he said, President Obama, the beloved Democratic Party politician, as recently as 2016, was, look, what we have to understand, and I think he used the phrase escalatory dominance, but his point was exactly that Ukraine has never been and never will be a vital interest to the United States, but it always will be, always has been, and always will be a vital interest to Russia because it's in their backyard, not ours. And therefore, it's impossible to beat Russia in Ukraine because if we try, they'll just take over not just Crimea, but all the Donbass and eastern Ukraine. And then a year later, in the Democratic Party, it became taboo, evil, immoral, maybe a sign of your disloyalty to raise that exact point. And I think what changed was a lot of Democrats became convinced that Putin won the election. But on the discourse, this is a thing that has really amazed me. When I started writing about politics, I focused on the war on terror and a lot of the abuses of civil liberties and American principles of due process and the like that I perceived was taking place. And at the time, anybody who questioned the war on terror of Bush and Cheney, especially 2003, 4, 5, was accused of being pro-terrorist or pro-Al-Qaeda, that you weren't defending your own country's legal values and constitutional principles, but you must be on the side of the terrorists. And I thought that tactic kind of went away, that it was obviously manipulative and deceitful. There was a lot of reasons why you would object to Bush-Cheney foreign policy without being pro-terrorist or pro-Osama bin Laden. And yet here we are, throughout the last 2.5 years, anybody who tried to introduce these ideas that you've talking about, which weren't just valid, but I think have been entirely vindicated, wasn't just excluded from the discourse, wasn't just told that you were wrong, but anyone who stood up and said it, and I know this, you know this, I've been put on official lists, as I believe you have been too, by the Ukrainian government. Yep. They would accuse you of being a Kremlin loyalist, kind of like a very McCarthyite discourse, that you were secretly getting paid by like the Kremlin, that you were loyal to Moscow over your own country. And that really did work. That continues to be the sort of primary tactic against people like yourself who have expressed dissent about this war. Why did that work? I mean, why does that? I honestly didn't think it would. I never thought it would when Hillary Clinton first raised it against Donald Trump with Russiagate. But it seems to have such a stranglehold, kind of ability to influence people, to deter people from speaking out, and to get other people really on board with this tribalistic notion that either you support your government's war or you're on the other side. Why do you think that works so well?
Well, let me say one basic point. The fundamental problem is that American foreign policy is against the interests of the American people, and therefore it is based on continuous lying. This is not new to Ukraine or to Gaza. Of course, it was part of the Iraq War. It was part of Syria, because how many Americans understand that Obama ordered the CIA to overthrow the Syrian government? It's almost not discussed. U.S. foreign policy is based on the idea that the U.S. should be the world's hegemonic power, the unchallenged, unrivaled power in every region of the world. Full spectrum dominance, meaning economic, military, technological, diplomatic, financial dominance in every part of the world. it's completely delusional. It's delusional. Well, maybe there was a brief period where after World War II, the U.S. stood dominant because the U.S. hadn't been destroyed militarily. Maybe there was a moment, and there was after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, when the U.S. in a way was unrivaled. But life is a little bit more complicated than the United States holding all the pieces in the world. Since we don't, trying to do so means nonstop wars. And the American people, if it was explained to them, hey, Americans, how do you feel about nonstop wars so that the U.S. can be the unchallenged power of the whole world? People would say, are you crazy? Leave me alone. I got to go back to work. I'm trying to raise my kids. You stop sending us so much threat, taxes, trillions of military spending, and so on. They never buy this stuff. And so the whole thing is based on lies. We have to go into Iraq. It's not us in Syria. It's the Russians in Syria. It's not us in Ukraine. It's Putin unprovoked, and on and on. It's such sad nonsense. But since it's based on lies, it has to be secret also. It cannot be that there's open discourse. You cannot allow open discourse when the lying is so relentless. And so it comes naturally that if you want to do something that is not possible, that is delusional, and is not what the public wants, and you have at least a formal structure of democracy, that we have elections and so forth, and there's supposed to be some voice of the people, then you have to lie. And when you have to lie, then everything has to be confidential. Then the worst crime in America, as you know very well, because you've reported on it more than anyone else in our country, is that you have to make the greatest criminal the one who tells the truth, or the one who leaks the truth, or the one who exposes the lying. And that becomes the modus operandi of the imperial state. So to my mind, the whole thing starts with the wrong premise, which is that the only way the United States can be safe in the world is to run the world, which is both impossible and extraordinarily costly and extraordinarily threatening of our survival.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the reasons why I focus so much on the need to protect the free flow of information, the free flow of debate, especially over the internet, because if the government or power centers get a hold of that and can control it, it doesn't just exclude dissenting voices, but more so it shields their propaganda and their lies from any kind of critical scrutiny. All right, let me ask you, so that was the first part. The second part is the identification of several what you called gambles that the United States government made with respect to Ukraine that ended up failing. I know it's always difficult to talk about motive because probably there are always mixed motives or multiple motives. But the thing is that not only was all of what happened predictable, it was actually predicted. We were just talking about what President Obama's view was about how after 8 years in office, he developed a pretty clear foreign policy, and he knew that the Russians would react the way that they've reacted if we try to expand NATO into Ukraine. But way before that, in 2008, the current director of the CIA, Bill Burns, wrote a memo to Condoleezza Rice, and at the time it was also Victoria Nuland. She was the U.S. ambassador to NATO under George Bush and Dick Cheney, where they were obsessed with this idea that we have to expand NATO as a bulwark against Russia. And Burns in a memo said, you people are crazy. I've spent a lot of time in Moscow, and if we do that, it's not just Putin, but pretty much every sector of Moscow's political factions, including Putin's opponents, his liberal opponents, who view NATO expansion into Ukraine as a red line, that they will that will automatically provoke the seizure of Crimea, their extreme interference with eastern Ukraine, just as a start. So everything that has happened was not a surprise. It was obviously known. I'm wondering, do you think that what happened was that the U.S. either disregarded that knowledge or decided it was worth it to risk because of how important Ukraine was? Or was there some level on which that provocation was part of the plan? In other words, we know that we tried to trap the Soviet Union in Afghanistan before. Other countries have done that to us. Was there some kind of sense of, let's draw Russia into a war because that'll weaken them and keep them fighting in a way that will undermine their strength in other sectors?
Well, first, that memo in 2008, everyone should go online and type in William Burns. Niet means niet is one title for this memo. The reason, incidentally, that we know about it is that Julian Assange revealed it to us. Otherwise, we'd never know about it.
Which is why he's in prison. Which is why he's in prison. Exactly. Just like we were talking about.
Exactly. And the memo is fascinating because it describes precisely why everything the U.S. is doing is wrong, why it's dangerous, why it could lead to war, why it's very unlikely to work. I find it fascinating for so many reasons. First, the clarity of the message. Burns is very smart. He was ambassador to Moscow. He is our finest diplomat. I wish he were Secretary of State rather than head of the CIA. But he said it very clearly. Second, it was ignored. So this is the second point. Third, we know about it only because of Julian Assange, which is another basic point, the one we've been speaking about. And it raises the question, so what is going on? Now, I have a basic theory that the main job of an American president, the overwhelmingly important job, is to keep a foot on the brakes. By the brakes, I mean stopping the war machine, which as a $1 trillion a year business is always revving. There are always generals who want war. There are always military contractors who want war. There are always crazed ideologues who want war. There's always people who want to test their new weapon systems. There are always people who want to beat the hell out of someplace. There are always expats who want to punish somebody or do something. The war machine is always revving. You have a huge standing army. You have 800 military bases around the world in 80 countries, You're going to have war all the time. So the best presidents, and they're very few, are the ones that know how to keep the foot on the brake. Because unlike a car that just idles and stays there, I know EVs are a little different, but you lift your foot off the brake, the car jumps forward. And this is why there are many motives of that. There's a lot of money in the war business. There are a lot of crazy people. There are a lot of generals whose life is war, after all, who don't care about diplomacy. They care about victory. Okay, whatever it is, the president is supposed to stop this stuff. Now, Obama didn't stop a lot of it, by the way. Obama lifted his foot from the brakes in Syria. So we had this completely cockamamie idea. Hillary loved it and others. Why don't we overthrow Bashar al-Assad? What could go wrong? What idiots, honest to God. Sorry, it was obvious in 2011 that this was idiocy. But President Obama signed the presidential finding to send the CIA in to overthrow Assad. We barely heard about it. It's called Operation Timber Sycamore. The New York Times covered it, I think, in 3 stories in a decade. So not so easy to know about or to hear about. But that was the president lifting his foot from the brakes. Another one was Libya. In Libya, Sarkozy and Hillary and others, and Cameron, thank you. He said, why don't we take that guy Gaddafi out? For what reason? Well, why not, was the theory. And so they concocted the Benghazi hoax, right to protect the Benghazi population, blah, blah, blah. He lifted his foot from the brakes, and we've now had Libya in chaos for the next 13 years. What could go wrong? In Ukraine, to his benefit, he kept the foot on the brake. And as soon as, not completely, but pretty well, of course, Trump lifted it and Biden put on the accelerator, because Biden played this game of regime change already back in 2014. We know it from the intercepted call of Victoria Nuland that says we're going to get the big guy, Biden, to do the attaboys to cement the new post-coup government. You don't make this stuff up. It's absolutely clear. So Biden's been part of this for a long time, this very group. Now, you ask, why did they do it? Because it takes skill and fortitude to keep your foot on the brakes. There are so many warmongers around. There are so many members of Congress who make a living off of the military-industrial complex. There are so many generals around. There are so many contractors around. There are so many ideologues around. And like you said, any restraint gets attacked by the right and the left. And you have to be very brave to fight that. Being for peace is not so easy for an American president. That's why we almost never avoid wars in this country, because we have an imperial state. It was founded in 1947. It has grown to gargantuan proportions, and it's very hard to stop.
What are your thoughts about the situation about U.S. policy at the moment?
What I wrote in that article was not just about keeping peace, but keeping us away from the nuclear precipice. And I referred to what many people listening will know, the doomsday clock. The doomsday clock is the notional idea of measuring how close we are to nuclear annihilation. It was started by the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists in 1947 to alert the world that in the new atomic age, of course, now we're in the thermonuclear age, we are capable of suicidal destruction of the planet in a way that wasn't true before 1945. And in 1947, these scientists and analysts of the global scene said we were 7 minutes till midnight, meaning that we were at the brink of nuclear war and nuclear annihilation. And of course, the idea was to keep us away from the brink. So what I looked at in that article was which presidents took us closer to midnight and which took us away from midnight. And it was very sobering to look at the clock from the American political point of view. Most American presidents have been failures, in my view, in foreign policy. Most have made the world more dangerous, not less dangerous. Most, of course, have presided over CIA campaigns to overthrow governments around the world. There have been perhaps 90 such regime change operations since 1947. They continue until this day. The U.S. foreign policy is based first and foremost on the principle, if you don't like your opponent, overthrow it, which is a very strange kind of diplomacy. Most diplomacy is if you don't like your opponent, find out a way to live together, actually have diplomacy. Even compromise, a word that's a completely dirty word in our lexicon. It became, quote, appeasement. It became one model, which is compromise means death. This is the psychology. So never compromise, never agree with an adversary, only defeat or overthrow an adversary. This is what most presidents have done. We have had a few skilled presidents, and Eisenhower was one of them, although it's a complicated record because he was a fiscal conservative. He didn't want to spend a lot of money, so he thought literally you get a lot of bang for the buck with nuclear weapons. So he was part of the arms race, but he also understood that there needed to be an agreement with the Soviet Union. President Kennedy saved the world after almost stumbling into nuclear annihilation in 1961 in the Bay of Pigs. CIA operation to overthrow the Cuban government. And then in 1962, the disaster on both sides of the Cuban Missile Crisis, when the Soviet Union put in offensive nuclear weapons into Cuba, and we came the closest we've ever come to nuclear annihilation. But then Kennedy and his counterpart, Nikita Khrushchev, were smart enough, human enough, decent enough, thoughtful enough, rational enough to pull us back from the brink and actually enter into what then became, for years and even decades, a nuclear arms control framework, starting with the Partial Nuclear Test Ban Treaty in 1963. Johnson put us closer to midnight again. Then Nixon, much reviled by me, by the way, in my youth, and by much of society, and of course forced to resign over Watergate, took us away from midnight through so-called détente in the early 1970s and his opening to China. And that was very clever. Jimmy Carter, who I liked as a president, contrary to much foreign policy, actually took us back towards midnight, to my chagrin, because we all learned decades after the fact and directly from the strategic author, the tactical author of this blunder, Zbigniew Brzezinski, was very proud of having assigned the CIA to run jihadists in Afghanistan, starting in 1979, with the idea of entrapping the Soviet Union in an Afghan invasion. So we created what became Al-Qaeda, what became the jihadist terrorism. This was a CIA op. Yes, it entrapped the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. It entrapped Afghanistan in what became more than 4 decades of U.S. completely created disaster. And it took the world back towards midnight. So Carter failed. The apogee of safety was Reagan and George Bush 1, because this was the end of the Cold War. We thought, didn't we? And this also, of course, was due to somebody who has a very mixed opinion. There's a very mixed opinion about him. I knew him. I actually worked for his economic team. I'm speaking of Mikhail Gorbachev. One thing I can tell you for certain is that Mikhail Gorbachev was a man of peace, which is absolutely remarkable. And unilaterally, he disbanded the Soviet military machine in Central and Eastern Europe, the so-called Warsaw Pact Alliance. And to their credit, both Reagan and Bush Sr. cooperated with Gorbachev relatively straightforwardly. And by the end of Bush Sr., we were 17 minutes from midnight. That means the farthest from nuclear war ever. But a funny thing happened on the way to peace, and that is the point of today, which is the U.S. could not take yes for an answer. We could not accept the idea of peaceful, mutually respectful, transparent cooperation with Russia. We just couldn't accept it. And by the way, what is fascinating looking back, it wasn't even about communism, which was the great bogeyman of the age. It was about Russia. Because as communism ended, as the Soviet Union ended, now we know, and this I think is the main point for our day, we know that as early as 1992, the goal, as expressed by then Defense Secretary Richard Cheney, who became perhaps the most influential single architect of American foreign policy for the next 20 years, was not only to end the Soviet threat or the communist threat, but to dismember Russia as well. Cheney's argument in 1992 was, well, the Soviet Union dissolved. Let's do the same with Russia. Russia can dissolve. And a very insightful way to understand this remarkably dangerous, bizarre, irresponsible, reckless idea is an article by Zbig Brzezinski, one of the architects of all of this period, in 1997, in an essay in Foreign Affairs magazine called A Strategy for Eurasia. And Brzezinski just casually notes, maybe we need 3 Russias in a loose confederation, maybe a European Russia, maybe a Siberian Russia, maybe a Far East Russia. Together, yes, but in a loose confederation. The point of reading this is to think about the arrogance, the hubris of American foreign policy, that it's going to dismember Russia. And that, I believe, has been the more than 30-year campaign. Dismember, surround, regime change operation, you name it. But we've got Russia on the ropes. The Soviet Union went down because we defeated it, not because of Gorbachev, not because of peace, not because of making a cooperative offering, but because we are the unipolar power of the world. No one comes close. The greatest colossus in world history, greater than the Roman Empire. This is how American leaders thought back in the 1990s. We have a president who lives today in the 1990s, Biden. This is his formation. It may be his current mental apparatus for all I know, but it is his phraseology till today, the indispensable country, the sole superpower, the country that the whole world turns to for leadership. And the idea was from the start, weaken, dismember, overthrow Russia. We are the sole superpower. So that's where NATO enlargement came in. That's where the U.S. support for jihadists around Russia's boundaries, whether in Chechnya or in the former Yugoslavia, came in, breaking apart Serbia in 1999 with the deliberate attempt to weaken a Russian ally, as well as to implant a NATO base in a, quote, new country, Kosovo. Oh, you're not supposed to change the map. The United States changed the map to have a NATO military base in Bondesteel and to break apart Serbia. 2002, withdraw from the ABM treaty unilaterally, the anti-ballistic missile treaty, put in Aegis missile systems in Poland and Romania starting in 2010, and of course, expand NATO to surround Russia in the Black Sea. Another Brzezinski project spelled out in 1997, stealing, as we've discussed in the past, from Lord Palmerston's ideas of the 1850s. Some ideas, some horrible ideas never die, and this one was brought back to life. But the point, Alexander, is that the presidents from Clinton onward, every single one, Clinton, Bush Jr., Obama, Trump, and Biden, every single one has moved us closer to midnight in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock. And we are now 90 seconds to midnight. Are you kidding? 90, they're trying to tell us something, and it's true. And if you don't hear it from the Doomsday Clock, just listen to any stupid European politician these days, because one is more stupid than the next. Let's taunt Russia. Let's provoke Russia. Of course, let's bomb Russia. Let's destroy Russia, says the big Baltic state presidents that want to bring us to nuclear disaster. One after the other makes no rational sense at all. Biden is adrift. He can't lead. So we are, as I have been thinking, with a stuck rudder heading towards the precipice, heading towards midnight, if you will, in the Doomsday Clock metaphor. And every day is bringing us closer, because we have a 3-front conflict right now, not one of which is being tamped down. We have Ukraine, we have the Middle East, and it's not only Israel's crazed and genocidal assault in Gaza, it's Israel's continuing attacks on Iran to bring the United States into a war with Iran. Good idea, Israel. Now we need hear today, even from the New York Times, no less, it's Israel's fake bot campaign on social media to continue to influence U.S. Congress. We don't even need to know about the fake social accounts, because the Israel lobby is powerful enough that it has held Congress in its thrall all this period. And we have the third front in Asia. As if it isn't enough, we are absolutely talking every day now. We have politicians, these are grown-ups, at least in appearance and by birth date, talking about war with China. So this is a kind of collective insanity. And incidentally, you know, I had an interview with Tucker Carlson recently, and it generates a lot of viewers and a lot of mail. And I got one just before we started from Germany saying, Professor Sachs, I enjoyed your interview, but you expressed a little bit of puzzlement about what is Germany doing and why is it so self-destructive and so forth. And then it went into a very intelligent discussion about how Germany and every country where this gentleman has worked in academia is completely under the U.S. mystique and U.S. thrall and U.S. influence peddling and U.S. money and military industrial complex. So he says completely impossible in the continental European context to say anything in academia that is against the United States. I don't have that direct sense, but it's shocking because I always thought, and again, I'm a naive guy, it takes me a long time to understand these things, but I thought Europe's the sophisticated one. 2,000 years of history. Europe's got the diplomacy. Europe's seen everything. It's done everything. It understands everything. But what I'm hearing from a lot of people is that there's no real debate anywhere in continental Europe right now. And we know in Britain, I always say Britain taught America everything it knows about all of this, all of this danger and saber rattling and wars of choice. And here we are. So 5 presidents in a row carrying us closer to nuclear annihilation than ever, and an American political system utterly and completely incapable of addressing this right now. Elections don't matter in November. This is something beyond the elections. This is something about the mentality, about the scale of the military-industrial complex, about the depth of these long-term projects, about the special role of the CIA in American society, because almost surely the most powerful institution in the land and the least known and least understood by design. And interestingly, just one last point of the rant, and sorry to carry on, but you know, when there's a real negotiation in the Middle East, when you really need to sit down to talk with Hamas, who goes from the United States? Not Blinken, but Burns, the CIA director. This is not an incidental point. What the hell is the CIA director doing negotiating this arrangement? The CIA is supposed to be an intelligence agency. Of course, we know it's a secret army, but it's amazing to see that. CIA director should not be the negotiator. But the CIA director is the negotiator because that's the real power in the American system right now. Jill, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for spending some time together. I'm so excited to be together with you, Jill. I am so enthusiastic about your candidacy, and we need you in the White House. This is the bottom line, and I'm going to do whatever I can to help you get there, because we really need you there. And this has been actually a pretty tough week. On my campus at Columbia, we had the police really take over the campus. They knock students around. We heard today that one of them let off a shot inside as they were taking students, arresting students, taking them into custody. It was a terrible week, unforgivable. Unforgivable for a university president to call the NYPD twice for students just exercising their rights to speech and to protest, but more than that, for being on absolutely the right side of this issue because they were protesting the mass slaughter that is taking place, that Israel is committing, I should say, in Gaza. And so it was a really unforgivable week. But Jill, the terrible nature of this was compounded by our political class in Washington, which is just egging on all of this brutal crackdown on voices calling for justice in this country. And it just goes from bad to worse. Bad is our president, President Biden, who, after everything, when he was asked, well, are you listening to the protesters? Is it changing your view? And we should understand, what is that view? That view is not just that we're watching a genocide. That view is American complicity in a genocide. We are providing the munitions, the arms. We're making it possible hour by hour, day to day. So when Biden was asked, well, is these protests changing your view? He had one word, no. And then he walked away from the podium. Many of you, no doubt, saw that. It turns my stomach, actually. First, the substance of it turns my stomach, because how can it be that a president of the United States doesn't listen to the call of justice across this country on now dozens and dozens, maybe hundreds of campuses, and when the students are right? The second thing is just how impervious Washington is to hearing decency right now, because the arrogance, president says no, and then he turns around and walks away from the podium. He doesn't have to defend anything, doesn't have to justify anything. This is the sheer arrogance. So that's the bad. The worst, I'm afraid, is Trump, because Trump said, well, the problem with that lady, referring to the president of Columbia University, that lady is, she wasn't tough enough, because Trump just delights and glories, at least in the rhetoric, of bashing in heads. And it's perfectly possible that that's what he has in mind for lots of different people in this country coming up. So, Jill, I'm here because you are the candidate of peace in this country, and we desperately need peace. Because we are veering, whether it is the Democrats or the Republicans, we are not only in the midst of wars, but we are absolutely veering towards World War III right now. I watch it close up. It's terrifying. You know, because we've chased each other on Zooms and emails and phone calls. In recent weeks, I'm on the road a lot, or in the air a lot, or seeing things from the perspective of other parts of the world. I'm talking to diplomats all over the world. I'm talking to heads of state all over the world. People are absolutely shocked, dismayed, and frightened by what is happening in this world, and by the absolute lack of any leadership from the United States for peace. And the US more and more is standing alone against the whole world. And that's Biden, God forbid. Trump, well, it's basically the same thing in my view. One can argue, I would say Trump is going to find a way to trump that of Biden, but Biden is absolutely dangerous right now, because we are drifting towards even larger wars everywhere. And this president doesn't understand it or doesn't care or has completely the wrong ideas or is incapable of addressing any of this. So what I'm seeing at the UN, what I'm seeing around the world, what I'm seeing in my discussions around the world is that we are in an extraordinarily dangerous time. Every one of the conflicts that we're in, I think, has a rather straightforward way to peace right now, because this is so dangerous, so irrational, but we're not taking any of that. You hear in Washington not one word about negotiations. They don't even believe in it. They don't even know it. There's no diplomacy left anymore. This is true in Ukraine, where I know I've been involved in Russia and Ukraine at the highest levels, at the head of state level in both countries for more than 30 years. I know all of them. I've watched this. The US tried to push NATO relentlessly over Russia's objection. There's a 2,000 kilometer border, and we're saying we can go where we want. American military bases can go where they want. We can put in Aegis missiles where we want, and we can overthrow governments when we want, like we did in 2014, helping to overthrow the Ukrainian government. And then a war breaks out, and that was just unprovoked, we say. And we provoked it for decades, actually. And then when the war breaks out and right away Russia and Ukraine sit down to negotiate, what does Biden do? He goes to tell the Ukrainians, no, fight on, don't negotiate, no neutrality. You're going to be in NATO, you fight on. Well, we just heard, actually, since the beginning of the year, there are more than 100,000 Ukrainian casualties. This is a disaster and a bloodbath that we are absolutely causing. In fact, I think there's nothing less than saying that we are causing it, because we reject every off-ramp for a peaceful settlement of this. We could have avoided the war. I begged Jake Sullivan in 2021, negotiate. Don't go into war. Oh, no, Jeff, don't worry. Yeah, right. Okay. I worried because I knew what I was talking about. They don't worry because I don't know what they think. But anyway, now we have a full raging war. President Macron of France, who gave me the Legion of Honor, and I'm wondering, oh my God, he's now talking, well, we're going to move NATO troops into Ukraine. Do we really want to have World War III in Ukraine? So that's one issue where I see complete lack of US leadership, sense, drift. Then comes this horrific genocide in Gaza, and it is completely unforgivable. I started going to Israel 52 years ago. I heard even 52 years ago in my first trip, 1972, after graduating high school, that Israel was going to put facts on the ground with the settlements in the occupied territories. And I thought, that's a little strange. It's against international law. Well, they have been doing this for decades, and all backed by the United States. And now with a full-fledged massacre underway, what we hear from the United States government every day is no conditions, no red lines to billions of dollars of American armaments and munitions. Now, the official count is 35,000 dead in Gaza, 70% women and children. But I'm talking to a lot of people who are saying very knowledgeably there are thousands more dead under the rubble whose deaths have not yet been counted, and tens of thousands of people who are dying of hunger, of lack of access to fresh water, of the destruction of the hospitals, which has been a systematic part of Israel's criminal military action. Now, here's another point just to mention. I'm in touch with diplomats across the Arab world. I meet them regularly. I meet foreign ministers, very frequently from the region. They are ready for peace on a just basis. So this is not that Israel's got its back to the wall and it's going to be destroyed. This is absolutely wrong. This is a situation that we could turn to peace in a day if the United States didn't continue to arm Israel and give Israel impunity to continue to commit this slaughter. Well, now, on top of all of this, just to add to our cheer on a Friday night, the United States is preparing and stoking a conflict with China. This has to be the dumbest, most dangerous, most provocative set of measures I know. I go to China all the time. I have a lot of students who are now senior officials. I know the leadership. China does not want a war. China does not want to attack the United States. China does not want to have any trouble. Thank you. China would like to have economic development. We are surrounding China just like the NATO enlargement in Europe. We're surrounding China everywhere. We get in the prime minister of Japan, the prime minister of Korea, we president of the Philippines, prime minister of Australia, all to trash talk China, badmouth China, and bolster military forces around China's perimeter. We have troops on the ground right now in Taiwan in complete violation of the One China policy, which is the bedrock of our diplomacy with China, or is supposed to be. But Biden has no limits. It's just completely ununderstandable to me how reckless this is. Oh, so I don't want to depress everyone on a Friday night because we're here to celebrate you, Jill, and your campaign. And this is why I give you my wholehearted support. We need you. We need you as president. We need you to be running the absolutely most successful, loud, aware campaign across this country, because you are the voice of peace for us. And you are leading the effort for peace at a time when we are in such danger of even further disaster right now. We have a president who has been part of the military-industrial complex his whole career, who has taken money from every big military contractor, who supported NATO enlargement at every step, who played his role in the 2014 coup that started the war in Ukraine, that has refused to negotiate, that is complicit in this genocide, that has actually intensified Trump's warmongering against China. That's our current White House, and then we know what's coming next, possibly. And so we need you. We need you to win this thing. That's the bottom line. That's why I'm here with your decency, your knowledge, your bravery, your leadership, all of the people that are supporting you, because I know that the people throughout the country that are on the line today are stalwarts for peace. As it says, people, planet, and peace as the core. I know that we can be heard. You can help us all to be heard. I know that the students across this country who are facing the police, the arrests, the brutality, the crackdowns are going to be flooding to you and the campaign. They need to. We want you. We're here for you. So thank you very much.
And, I'll just send it right back at you, because we were so, first going way back, I think it was in 2022 when we became aware of what a profound resource you were as the Ukraine war was unfolding. I think that's when I started following you on like a daily basis to understand what was happening in Ukraine and to have like a really good foundation for, for trying to avert this war that had no excuse from the get-go. And the more, I learned about Ukraine and how it was an absolutely ginned up war, from starting really back in the Clinton administration when NATO began to expand eastward.
Exactly.
Yeah, really against the promises that had been made to Gorbachev at the time that Germany was reunited. This was just considered absolutely nuts when Clinton first started pushing it. And, and then I guess it just continued to roll forward, and it was just so crazy. And with the Maidan and the violence in 2014, in the revolution that then turned out to have been really also very much provoked. I don't know that it was entirely at the
a lot of rigging in it. I saw some of it close up, that rigging. Not everything, but enough to say, my God, what are we doing? We're jeopardizing a whole country this way. We're playing games.
Yes, and that the phone call of Victoria Nuland, where she was plotting sort of who was going to be the beneficiary of the coup. It was just such a shocking and horrifying moment. It was like, here comes regime change number 70 or whatever it was, but in a really serious kind of catastrophic place and time. When Russia's nuclear missiles were placed on the U.S. border, that is in Cuba in the 1960s, the U.S. basically had the nuclear weapons in the air. We did not take this lightly for nuclear weapons to be on our border. So it's entirely understandable why Russia doesn't want nuclear compatible missiles on their border either.
That's it.
Yeah, and it was just such a
so unnecessary, by the way. Absolutely nothing at stake for us to be pushing NATO up to that border when we know that the Russians have been saying for 30 years. I was Yeltsin's advisor back in 1991, 92. The Russians were begging us, Jill, we just want to be normal. We want to be friends. We want to be part of this world. The U.S. could not take that. No, you can't be normal. We're the victor. We will decide what normal is. NATO, sure, we do what we want. And by the way, as you said, when Clinton started that, his Secretary of Defense, very decent man, Bill Perry, agonized, should I resign? This is so crazy. This is so unnecessary. This is so provocative. George Kennan, who was the great scholar statesman of the second half of the 20th century on U.S.-Russian relations, Kennan said, this is the biggest single mistake we can make. So we kind of dreamt this resurgence of war through this arrogant approach. Amazing.
It is amazing. And it was so empowering, I guess, to discover that you were there with kind of the same outlook that we hold as Greens, that I hold as, just a peace advocate born and bred, in the Vietnam War, wondering, standing out in front of my public library as a high school student, along with a group of us that couldn't figure out why are our friends being drafted to go fight in this war? What does that have to do with us? So, just having a skeptical viewpoint in general, which, I felt like I found such a home in the Green Party for people who just don't, we don't drink the Kool-Aid.
Exactly.
Kool-Aid on war, on fossil fuels, on oligarchy, on crushing inequality. Greens just don't drink the Kool-Aid. So we've been a little bit out of the mainstream, but as the mainstream continues to crash and burn, it's been quite validating to see how many people are kind of coming into alignment with us on, our basic points of view, but discovering, that you especially are a resource who does not take marching orders from the economic and political elites. It was just so refreshing to see that you were there. And then when I heard that you were no longer a member of the Democratic Party, I think you announced, I want to say maybe 4 months ago, something like that. It wasn't that long ago. I began to think, oh my God, so Jeffrey Sachs is no longer a member of the Democratic Party. We need him, we need him in this campaign. We need him in this kind of political movement to just help us be grounded. And, I will say, to the credit of Greens, they do a lot of their homework. They really do their homework, especially around issues of war and peace. But there's nothing like having a front row seat to history, and actually having been there when all this was happening. So it was just so inspiring to see that, well, maybe we could find a way to make contact with you. And for months, I was trying to figure out how can we make contact with you. And then suddenly, maybe a month ago, I got an email from Sonia, Jeffrey's wife, just putting me on Jeff's distribution list for his writings. And so I wrote her back and I said, thank you so much. I'm a big fan. I'm really glad to be, on the direct recipient list here. And then she wrote back, to the effect of, well, we're following you too.
Yep.
So I then said, well, you know what? I'm going to be in New York next week. Why don't we get together and brainstorm, how